Okay, guys, we're actually in your mental health book on chapter 20, Crisis and Mass Disaster. So it's page 397. So go ahead and grab your book, and we will get started on page 397. Your book talks about 3 different types of crisis. And so we're on page 391 or 99. It talks about why do we need to study crisis. And so crisis intervention is what nurses and other healthcare providers do to assist someone when they are in a crisis. We try to help them to cope. So first type of crisis, maturational crisis. This is essentially an internal crisis, and it's based on Erikson's 8 stages of growth and development. So let's say, for instance, you're new to the developmental stage of ego integrity versus despair. What this particular crisis is saying is that we are in a new stage, and the coping skills that we had for the previous stage will not necessarily work, and we have to develop sufficient new coping skills. And if we don't do that, then we can end up in a maturational crisis. Some people move through this more quickly than others. Some people may, for instance, be inhibited or hindered by alcohol or drug addiction, other personal things that are going on into their lifestyle. But hopefully the outcome is that we have a successful resolution of our new stage. We have developed the coping skills that we need, and we do not experience this particular type of crisis. Flip the page, it talks about situational crisis. A situational crisis arises from an external force rather than an internal force. So a situational crisis relates to an external force versus an internal, such as the death of a loved one. Okay? And this outcome is dependent upon the degree of support the patient has, their emotional and physical status, their ability to understand and willingness to cope with the meaning of the stressful event. And last, we talk about disasters. And so a disaster is not a part of everyday life. It is unplanned and it is accidental. There are different types of disasters. A natural disaster, such as the hurricanes we've had down in Florida. A national disaster, such as riots, airplane crashes, war. And then your book goes on to identify crimes of violence. It does say that terrorism is a different form of a disaster, and that it is committed by people who mean to harm and kill innocent lives, and that there is no warning or expectation that it's going to happen. No matter what the disaster occurs from, natural versus natural versus national disaster, it can end up in what we call mass casualty incidents. Mass casualty incidents result in an excessive number of mortalities and increased morbidity and extensive damage to properties, roads, electrical lines, etc. It depletes the local, regional, or state's resources, and they are difficult to recover from. Okay, on page 401, again, mass casualty incidents involve greater than 100 people. We talked about a disaster. A disaster means that extra effort is involved. It's above an everyday emergency. We need extra help to deal with it. We talked about natural versus man-made, and we've talked about what terrorism is. We're not going to be concerned with conventional versus non-conventional. Your book goes on to talk about triage. A great word for triage is simply sorting, sorting out with red, yellow, green, and black, and you'll see that on your admission ticket that I provided. And so triage, according to your book, is a term that means its ability to distribute casualties to the most appropriate facility or holding ground for proper care. So triage, we're going to sort. We're going to sort out our victims involved so they can get the most appropriate care. Now, reverse triage can be implemented when you have a mass casualty incident and have greater than 100 people and you can't take care of them all. We do reverse triage, meaning the greatest good for the greatest number of people, focusing on those individuals that can safely get themselves out, such as the green and the yellow, and less effort on those that are critically injured, such as your reds. Black means that they are close to or have died. This is just a little extra, but when you're looking at disasters, what happens with your local government is they classify them as levels. Levels 1, 2, and 3. A level 1 means that the locals can deal with it. So for instance, if you had a school bus that had an accident and you had several children taken to a local hospital or hospitals, the hospital could then implement their disaster protocol and deal with it sufficiently without extra support from the community. A stage 2 requires regional help. Now we have multiple victims who require help. We need the shelters to open, for instance. We might need the National Guard to be put on alert or actually put on active duty. The governor of a state might declare that we're in a state of emergency. A level 2 is often your hurricanes or your tropical storms. A level 3 is the highest level. It means that there's mass casualty and increased morbidity. And yes, we have to have local, regional, state, and federal help. When it can be declared a federal disaster, then there is increased aid that's offered to the residents. And so when you have an intense national disaster or natural disaster, often it is declared a federal emergency, so you can get federal aid to help with the assistance of recovery. This is not in your book, but I wanted to introduce it. There are stages of disasters. There's 5 stages. One thing, a term that you might hear, mitigation. Mitigation is a term that we use, and it means what are we doing as a community to decrease the ill effects of a disaster on our environment and people. And so a lot of times you'll find mitigation is wrapped in all these different stages of disasters. We're always in the non-disaster stage. And in the non-disaster stage, what's happening is we're preparing. This is where, for instance, hospitals have disaster drills, where they have a team or a community or committee that actually deals with disaster preparedness. So we're preparing, we're stocking, we're making sure we're ready. Not all the time do we have a pre-disaster stage, but like for hurricanes, we do. This is when we know it's coming. So there's awareness, there's awareness that there's a disaster coming, and we do what we need to get ready. For instance, the Red Cross might be told to go to a certain area to set up. We would open schools for shelters. We would make sure that there's plenty of food and water for individuals that might be impacted. The impact stage is the actual time when the disaster's hitting, the hurricane's hitting, the tornado is hitting. And during the impact stage, people need to be safe and secure, and they need to stay safe and secure. And this is a form of mitigation. Your residents are doing what they're supposed to do to keep themselves safe, and they're not moving about. The only people that are out are your emergency personnel. This next stage, the emergency stage, is the disaster has been completed, the hurricane has moved on, and now we're in a state of emergency. Our priority being making sure that all residents of the area affected are safe, they're rescued, they're triaged to the appropriate area. So after a tornado, the rescue personnel go out into the community that's been affected. They find their victims, they triage them appropriately to facilities,
until they can account for everybody. The emergency stage is actually not supposed to be complete until you have a final victim count or all individuals have actually been accounted for. Then you get into the reconstruction phase. This is the rebuilding phase, and obviously it is the longest phase. When you have a massive tornado, such as the picture I showed you, and that was from Moore, Oklahoma, it will take them decades to rebuild that community that was flattened. It took decades to get New York back to where it was before 9/11. Rebuild the levees in New Orleans after the Hurricane Katrina. And so the reconstruction stage is often the longest. And there are acts of mitigation within the reconstruction phase. For instance, the levees that broke in Katrina, hopefully they were rebuilt in a manner in which they wouldn't be breached again.
So we have someone that's in a crisis. We need to, first assess. We need to assess actually the patient's perception of the crisis and how do they perceive the crisis and what is their strengths. Not everything is viewed the same by all patients, and so we definitely have to understand and view the crisis through the eyes of the patient. And we also have to assess the individual or family's perception of the problem. What is their support system? What are the resources available? Is this individual isolated? Are there people that we can ask to aid them? If not, is there some type of temporary support system that we could set up? There's some good questions. With whom do you live with? To whom do you talk to? Who can you trust? Who can help you? And then we have to assess the person's level of anxiety. And once again, not everybody's coping mechanisms are the same. We need to assess what are their coping mechanisms. Is it eating? Is it drinking? Is it smoking? We need to make sure that they don't have any thoughts of killing themselves or anyone else. What do they do to feel better? Have they tried to make whatever that is that they feel better? Have they tried it this time? What's helped in the past with difficult times? Once we assess, we can come up with possible diagnosis such as anxiety, and it's related to fear of whatever, or compromised family coping related to whatever is the situation. Okay, so we're on page 404 in your book. It talks about planning, and it talks about disaster nursing. A lot of times include being members of a mobile crisis unit, a group that helps provide crisis intervention. You provide health education, crisis prevention, etc. We look at implementation. We have to make sure that our patient is safe. That's first. Is there anything that we need to do to protect the patient that is in crisis? And what can we do to reduce their level of anxiety? We have to make sure that the patient is in charge of his or her own life, is able to make decisions, and the crisis counseling relationship is one between partners. This chapter also talks about different levels of care, nursing care. You guys have probably learned about these in MP1. We'll go back over them. Primary care promotes mental health and reduces mental illness to decrease the incidence of crisis. It's one-on-one. So we work with an individual to recognize or identify potential problems, help them to identify specific coping skills, and assist them in evaluating the timing of life changes. Secondary care is established interventions during acute crisis, and it's to prevent prolonged anxiety from the crisis, and this occurs in hospital units, emergency departments, clinics, and or mental health. You flip the page, it talks about tertiary care, and this is support for those who've experienced a crisis and they're now recovering. And this often happens in rehab centers, shelters, workshops, day hospitals, and outpatient clinics. Part of tertiary care is what we call critical incident stress debriefing. And this is a intervention for a group of people that has experienced a crisis. On this page you can see there are phases of the critical incident stress debriefing. that are to be followed, and you guys can read through this. And then we talk about evaluation. We're looking at the person in crisis, and we're following up typically 4 to 8 weeks after the initial interview, and we're asking ourselves, still, is the patient saved? Have they developed more adaptive ways to cope? Do they have a stronger existing support system? Has the patient maintained an optimal level of functioning, and has the patient returned to the pre-crisis level of functioning?